Hello fellow readers and readresses, I'm coming to you with not a speck of makeup from my car in the middle of nowhere. So, we're gonna do my wrap-up for October. Spoiler alert, I did way better than I expected initially, and somehow I'm still disappointed by it. I don't know why, it's a weird thing. Maybe I'll dive into it deeper with my therapist. Let's begin by going through the books that were actually on my TBR for October. We had Northern Lights by Philip Pullman, which was a bookshelf jar pick. We had Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie, which was a prompt to read a book recommended by a friend. Then we had Ancient High Tech by Frank Joseph, which was another bookshelf jar pick. Then Short Story Masterpieces with a Twist Ending by various authors, which was another bookshelf jar pick. Skunk and Badger by Amy Timberlake, bookshelf jar pick. Wizard's First Rule, bookshelf jar pick, but it was also the book that covered my prompts for the Buzzword Reading Challenge and Adventure in LDA Reading Challenge. And then we had Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo, which was a leftover from September. A Lion's Tale by Chris Jericho, which was another leftover from September. And Witch King by Martha Wells, which was another leftover from September. Now, I'm going to start with the embarrassing part and get it out of the way. I am still reading A Lion's Tale by Chris Jericho. This book I actually had on my August TBR and wasn't able to finish it. And now I'm continuing to drag it on into November, apparently. But it is what it is. I'm going to read it when I read it. I'm enjoying this book, but I just haven't picked it up in like 3 weeks already, and I never seem to get to it. And when I do, I read like a chapter and then I move on to doing something else. So I made my peace that this book is just going to be read whenever it's going to be read, and that's that. The other thing is that Witch King by Martha Wells, I decided to temporarily DNF it, not because it's a bad book or there's anything particularly bad with it in general. I just read like 3 pages from it and realized that this is not what I want to read right now, and so I'm just going to put it back on my bookshelves and I'm going to pick it up another time. Now, for the things that I actually read in the month of October, we're going to go through them in the order in which I finished them. Starting with Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo. This is an adult urban fantasy and the second book in the Alex Stern trilogy. I thought it was going to be duology. Turns out it's a trilogy. This book, I didn't really feel like picking it up. Matter of fact, when I got it in September, I think I reacted with a bit of a scoff. And I think I should have known better, because every time I pick a book by Leigh Bardugo, even if I end up not loving the book necessarily, I do enjoy the reading experience because the author has this writing style that makes everything easy to go through. In this case though, I actually ended up liking the book as well. I think I gave it 4.5 stars in general. This story is so interesting, and while I'm not a big fan of the university setting, for some reason I find it mildly boring. In this case, I think the author did an amazing job and continued the story in a very, very interesting way, and I'm very, very curious to see how the third book is going to turn out, because there were some very interesting developments that happened in this book. And I'm not going to talk about the synopsis because it's a second book in the series and I don't want to spoil it. As I mentioned, I think the story is very well written, and I don't just mean in terms of writing style. The world building is very interesting, the characters are very vivid, and the plot goes in places that you don't expect it to. So I had a good time with this book. I would like to warn you though that this book is very, very adult. Everything that I had read by Leigh Bardugo prior to it was young adult, and this series is really, really brutal in a lot of ways. So please go into it taking that into consideration. As I mentioned, I gave the book 4.5 stars and I'm definitely continuing with the series. The next book that I read in October wasn't at all on my TBR and is not something that I generally would read, being that it's fantasy romance. And if you've watched 1 or 2 videos on this channel, you know that romance is definitely not my forte. On top of that, this book is a reread, which means that I not only liked it, but I liked it enough to want to reread it. The book is Radiance by Draven, which is the first book in the... what was it? Wraith Kings? Is that how you pronounce it? Wraith Kings series. The series is 4 books long, 3 books long, I don't know at this point. This is the only book from the series that I've read, and I absolutely love it. I gave the book 4.5 stars yet again, and I had the best time reading it. How I decided to pick it up actually is by talking to one of my friends who's on Romantic Wave. in terms of reading, and so I recommended this book to her. And thinking about this book got me into the mood to actually reread it, and I did. I have the ebook for many years now. I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years, and I reread it within a day and a half, and yet again had the best time. Why I love this book is because I love the character. Sound like a very generic statement, and in every other case it would be, but I have a problem with the characters in romantic books, being that I often am very annoyed by the main female character because the authors tend to, and I don't mean every author, I'm just generalizing here because this is the experience that I've had generally with romance. The main female character is usually very annoying, very not like other girly, selfish, ignorant, disrespectful, unreasonable, you name it. In this case, we had a woman that was just kind, smart, wasn't making big drama out of everything, my kind of girl. And the guy that was her main love interest was actually worthy of respect himself as well, and I really liked that. And on top of that, we didn't overutilize the misunderstanding trope, which is a big thing in a lot of the romance books that I have ran into. The added bonus is that the world is very curious, although not very developed. I still really enjoyed it. I find the book very atmospheric, and I had really good time with it. So if you're looking for a fantasy romance that has nice character and an interesting plot line and deep conversations and all of that, I highly recommend this one. I think you're gonna love it. There is even some love making scenes, which I kind of skim through because I feel a little uncomfortable reading about other people's intimate moments. But if you do enjoy that, I want you to know that I'm not judging you. I think that's awesome. I'm kind of envious of that, to be honest. So have at it. I think you would have a great time. And this time I'm actually considering continuing with the series eventually. Now, the third book that I finished in the month of October was Wizard's First Rule by Terry Goodkind. This is an adult epic fantasy and the first book in the Sword of Truth series. In one of my reading vlogs from October, I mentioned that I was reading it at the time. I was at like 30% of the book, and at the time I thought that it was one of the best classic fantasy books. Since then, I have changed my mind almost completely, and I ended up giving the book 3 stars only, and that is because after about 35% maybe of the book, some patterns started to emerge to me, and some things started to make very bad impression on me. To begin with, the book is very derivative of other works, and very obviously so. I don't have an issue with books not being totally original and being totally unpredictable. This is not something that I necessarily require from a book to enjoy it. But when you have characters and scenes copy-pasted from other stories into this one, it becomes pretty much impossible for me to enjoy this story and not judge it. If I have to mention some IPs, I'm gonna start with The Lord of the Rings because we have a character that is literally Gollum from The Lord of the Rings. And then we have so much borrowed from The Wheel of Time, I don't even know where to begin. We have so much borrowed from Star Wars, just so many things. And it wasn't even just that, because the book was painfully predictable, but the author acted as though it wasn't. He would present a mystery somewhere in the beginning of the book, and immediately you will know what the outcome of this mystery is gonna be, or what the answer to this mystery is gonna be. But the author kept on trying to throw little clues here and there, and kept on dragging it throughout the entire book unnecessarily. It was basically infuriating, and I didn't know whether he didn't realize that it was obvious or whether he didn't care, but it felt like wasting my time. And then there was this thing that I'm basically tired of seeing in books, and is the one thing that can turn me off of an author instantaneously, and that is unnecessary sexual violence against children. Now, I'm not saying that it should never be in books, but if it's in a book, I would like it to make sense to be there and to mean something. So if you can entirely remove it from the book without having any zero impact on the story, like it was in this case, then that means that it's unnecessary and that it was put in the book only because the author wanted it to be there. And every time I see that, I can't help but derive conclusions from it, negative conclusions. And lastly, I think that the author has tried to create a highly philosophical work, and in that aspect, my observation is that he borrowed quite a bit from Ayn Rand, but on quite a few occasions, he has failed to maintain moral and logical consistency in in his musings, and you will see that this is a big theme for me this month and why I disliked yet another book that I expected to be highly rated. And we'll talk about it in a bit. And seeing this in the book left me with the impression that the author's musings were more performative rather than based on actual conviction, extending all the way to the main character's moral triumph, which did not ring true, no pun intended. So all of that being said, if you can ignore the obvious influences to this story and the other things that I just mentioned, there is a high likelihood you might enjoy this book. There was a lot of work put into it despite, again, all of my criticism, so I feel comfortable giving the book 3 stars, but I will not be continuing with this series anymore, unless some unforeseen circumstances occur. Next, in October, I finished Northern Lights by Philip Pullman, which is a young adult, allegedly fantasy, and the first book in his Dark Material series. It is basically a sci fantasy set in a world that is very similar to ours, with some differences, one of the more notable of which is that people have demons, which is basically kind of a representation of their soul in the physical world, taking the form of an animal that follows them around. It's really, really cute. We follow this young girl called Lyra, who is an orphan and lives in a university. She is a bit of a wild child, and whilst trying to spy on a conversation, she learns some information that she's not supposed to know. And then the circumstances go in such a way that she needs to go on a journey, and she does, and we go with her, and it's magical and it's lovely. But I will say that this book, in my opinion, is not very well suited for children, because while it's very whimsical and the world is very magical, it deals with a lot of heavy topics, a lot of heavy politics, and a lot of death, so I would rather recommend it for adults. I absolutely love this story. I had the best time reading it. I read it within a day. You can see it in a vlog that I have on my channel, and I gave the book 5 stars, and I kind of regret the fact that I don't own the rest of the series as of right now. Next, I finished Short Story Masterpieces with a Twist Ending, Volume 1 by various authors. This collection features 23 short stories by some authors that I admired prior to reading it, and some authors I wasn't familiar with at all. Each story comes with the promised twist ending, and while I can't honestly call all of the masterpieces, I didn't dislike any of them. The book was definitely worth reading. I gave it 4.5 stars, and I highly recommend it. Now, I have taken some notes here, and I would like to say a few words about some of the stories that made the most impression on me. Biggest impression on me? Whatever. We're gonna start with my favorite story of this entire book, and that is The Open Window by Hector Hugh Munro, or Saki. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing any of this correctly. Please excuse that. As I already mentioned, this was my most favorite of all of the stories. It took me all of 5 minutes to read, and it got me through an entire wheel of emotions. I can't recommend it highly enough. If you can put your hands on it, please read it. You will not be sorry. And then we have The Lady or the Tiger, and this one, I'm honestly still thinking about it, and I don't know if I like the ending. It's one of the most frustrating endings I've ever read in my life. It probably will frustrate you too, but it offers such a morbid dilemma, and I can't help but ponder it all the time. Again, I'm still thinking about it pretty much every day, so I recommend you give it a go. Then we have The Case of Lady Sannox by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and this one grabbed me from the beginning. It offers a very interesting mystery in the first 2 paragraphs, and then it keeps you going throughout the whole story. I was very, very curious about what's gonna happen, what the outcome is gonna be. Loved it, highly recommend it. If I had one criticism, it would be that I kind of wish it was a little bit longer. Then we have The Bet by Anton Chekhov, and I wouldn't say that I recommend this one, and I wouldn't say that I necessarily loved it, but it did prompt a lot of thinking. So if you are interested in partaking in some existential dread, I would recommend this one, I guess. Next, we have Myra Meets His Family by Francis Scott Fitzgerald, and this one was so entertaining. I think it was the most fun story of the entire collection. At least it was fun for me to read. Now, mind you, I did not like it in the beginning. 2 pages in, I thought that I'm definitely gonna hate this story, and I'm definitely gonna hate the author's writing in general. But I am so happy I disregarded this first impression and continued reading this story, because I would have missed out on a lot of fun. Then we have The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. Now, if you're interested in scaring yourself to death, I will recommend this one. I don't necessarily like scary things, but this one both terrified me and fascinated me the whole way through, and I loved it. And the story was so sinister and dark, I can't believe I enjoyed it so much. And last, but definitely not least, we have Our Aromatic Uncle by Henry Killer Bunner. I have no idea how to pronounce this. I'm gonna read you the first sentence of the story. It is always with a feeling of personal tenderness and regret that I recall this story. This is how the story starts, and this is exactly how I feel about this story. It is heartwarming and heartbreaking. I loved it. I loved it. It was great. It's the last story in the book, and it got me to cry, actually. I still tear up thinking about it a little bit, and maybe it's not gonna have the same effect to everyone, but to me specifically, it had it. And not just because it was sad, because it wasn't necessarily sad throughout it. It had a little bit of a sad moment in it and sad realization about things, but it was so beautiful. The writing style was so lovely. Chef's kiss. And the twist ending becomes a little bit obvious at some point, but not entirely, because what it turns out to be at the end kind of surprised me, and then I had to go back and read something from the beginning, and then this is when I started actually crying because it was so touching, and it was great. Highly recommend. Actually, this one I think I was able to find free on the internet, and I'm sure it's not the only free story you can find out there, because a lot of those authors, well, maybe all of them, are already deceased, and I think the copyright for these stories says expired. I don't know if the word expired is correct here, but you know what I mean, I guess. Also, there were some stories by Ambrose Bierce and Kate Chopin that honestly amazing, but I couldn't mention all the stories here, so please give the book a go if you can find it. It's really, really good. And then, oh boy, I finished a book that I'm probably gonna get a bit of hate for my opinion of, but I'm here to talk about the books that I read in an honest way, and that's exactly what I'm gonna do. The book that I'm talking about is Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie, and it was a 5-star prediction for me, and I ended up giving it 3 stars and being very, very disappointed by it. Now, am I saying that this book doesn't deserve to be read? Absolutely not. Obviously, I gave it 3 stars. 3 stars is not a terrible rating, but it's definitely not a masterpiece in my opinion, like I have grown to expect by Joe Abercrombie. Mainly, it was because I did not like the characters that we followed, and more specifically, the main character that we followed. I will recommend you go ahead and read my Goodreads review of this book. I will link it down below, and I don't usually do that. I don't have the habit of redirecting people to Goodreads to read my opinion, since I'm here to talk about it anyway, but I wouldn't like to paraphrase it too much. I think I expressed myself in a very good way there, and since I don't want to read it here, I will definitely recommend you go and read it. Basically, I don't think there was any moral consistency when it comes to the character of the main character. The author was going for an arc for that character that starts one place and then ends in another place, and basically trying to change our opinion drastically on who this person was. However, on page, with her actions, he was showing us something completely different from the narrative that he was going for. Again, this is very vague, but since it concerns the entire arc of a given character, I don't want to talk about it because this is going to spoil the whole book basically. So please go ahead and read that review. I have gone into spoilers someplace, and I obviously mark them as spoilers, so you're not going to be spoiled, but it goes into depth as to why I dislike this book so much. As I mentioned already, the book is not trash. It is not without its merits, namely the amazing writing style of this author. There were also some appearances from characters that we've seen in the original trilogy that were amazing, and I still love them, but I think that this story definitely lacked some of the depth of the original trilogy, as well as the amazing and complicated character development that we had in the first 3 books, even though the author has tried to replicate it unsuccessfully in my opinion, obviously. And I think the book was slightly more boring because for a big chunk of this book, I didn't care what these battles were fought for, by whom, what was the outcome. I generally didn't care. So I gave the book 3 stars. I was disappointed. I know I'm in the minority in this opinion, but I am very, very sure in my conviction, and I have my arguments, and I thought about it a lot, and I think I'm correct. With that being said, I would still like to hear your opinion on this book if you've read it, because we're none of us infallible, me included, more so than a lot of other people. So I would really appreciate some more context that maybe I've missed. I don't think I have, but again, You never know. And I would like to have a discussion. It's a very interesting case for me where I had such a strong conviction that this is going to be a 5-star book, and rarely have I been this wrong. So let's have a chat about it if you've read it and you have some time to spare and you don't mind talking to me. Next, I finished Ancient High Tech by Frank Joseph, which is a nonfiction book about lost discoveries by ancient races. And I'm saying nonfiction, but I'm using this term a little bit loosely because, okay, I didn't necessarily love this book. I gave it 2.5 to 3 stars, and I don't know if I would recommend it, to be honest. There was a time in my life where nonfiction about history and ancient people were my bread and butter. I would read only that for days, for months. I would go very obsessed with these books and try to find all the information that I could about the topics that they were discussing. And I was really hoping that this book is gonna reignite that in me and make me very excited, and for a second there it did. However, very quickly I realized that this book is more of a clickbait in a book form, if I can put it that way. It was written as a sensationalist piece of work where the author took some random discoveries that were seemingly unexplained and then turned them into these big things based basically only on conjecture and pretty much no evidence. For example, in the beginning of the book there is a discussion about this fresco, is it the word, a relief of a guy on a bicycle that was found on the wall of an ancient Indian temple, which was supposedly made thousands of years ago when bicycles weren't discovered yet. And the author took it as a fact and ran with it and came up with a bunch of wild claims based on that. However, a very quick research tells you that this relief was actually way younger than the temple itself, because it was proven that the relief was made in the beginning of the 20th century during a restoration of the temple. And that's not the only thing. The author tends to take theories, turn them into facts in his mind, and then base a lot of wild conjecture on these theory facts. For example, he based a lot of his conclusions on the fact that Atlantis exists. Now, I'm not a historian, but based on a lot of the evidence that you can find out there, it seems to become apparent that Atlantis was seemingly invented out of pure air by Plato. Certainly, we don't have enough evidence to claim that Atlantis was real. Now, do I want it to be real? Absolutely, but we can't start our research based on our wishful thinking. We have to start it with whatever proven facts we have in front of us. And again, based on those, we can only draw the sad conclusion that Atlantis does not exist. And this is basically a lot of what this book was. Wild conjecture, wild guesses, wild theories, wishful thinking, not a lot of facts, so I don't know if I could call it nonfiction necessarily. On top of that, the writing style seemed really simplistic, and I don't mean minimalistic, I mean really simplistic, like me back when I was in middle school and I was writing reports. There was nothing beautiful or engaging in my writing style, and that's exactly how I felt about this one. So, as I already mentioned, I gave the book 2.5 to 3 stars because I still learned some things from it, and I didn't necessarily hate it all the way through. But again, I wouldn't go as far as to recommend it. And the last book that I read in October, I read on the pretty much last day of the month, and that was Skunk and Badger by Amy Timberlake. This book was nice. I liked it. The story was cute. It was interesting, but I gave it 3 stars because the writing style was so weird. Obviously, the book is middle grade. It's written for small children, and their line of thought doesn't necessarily always make sense. You know how when a kid tells you a story, you start a place and you go through weird places and you end up in an even weirder place sometimes. So, you know, take my opinion with a grain of salt. I'm sure not a lot of you are here for my opinion on middle grade books, but honestly, this writing style seemed like low effort to me. That's basically how I felt about it. Low effort. And so I gave the book 3 stars. I don't have much to say about it. The book itself was very beautiful, with very beautiful pages, very high quality, very nice illustrations. It was cute. It was atmospheric. It was okay. Not a masterpiece, but it was okay. So in total, in the month of October, I read 8 books, which equated to 3,327 pages. In terms of genre, we had 5 fantasies, 1 romance, 1 nonfiction, and 1 collection of short stories. In terms of formatting, we had 4 paperbacks, 3 hardbacks, and 1 ebook. And in terms of sourcing, I owned every single one of these books. So, all in all, a great reading month, even though I was kind of disappointed by some of the books, especially the ones that I was looking forward to the most. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Please let me know what you read in the month of October, and if you've read any of these books, I would love to hear your opinion about them. Spoiler free, of course, unless you put a spoiler tag in your comment. Thank you so much for watching, and if you'd like to see some of my other wrap-ups or book reviews, check out this playlist. Bye!